Hi, it's Gwyn and welcome back to the Revolver Beatle channel. The 1990s, the decade when Britain rediscovered its confidence, musically, culturally, even fashionably. There were bucket hats, Union Jack guitars and more Parkers than the British winter really needed. And right at the heart of all that swagger, a quiet but unmistakable force. The Beatles. Because while Britpop strutted and shouted about being modern, its heart was vintage, and every chord, harmony and catchy chorus carried the unmistakable DNA of John, Paul, George and Ringo. But let's face it, being a Beatles fan in the late 70s and in the 80s was simply not cool. The Beatles considered by many to be yesterday's news, and it was refreshing in the 1990s to hear their legacy being respected and reimagined through a plethora of guitar-based groups wearing the Beatles' influence loud and proud. So today on the Revolver's Beatles channel, we're counting down the top 10 Britpop bands influenced by the Beatles and showing exactly how the Fab Four echoed through the 1990s. At number 10, the Charlatans. Before Britpop even became a buzzword, the Charlatans were already waving the psychedelic flag high. Part of the Manchester scene, they fused Hammond organ grooves and jangly guitars like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds had gone clubbing. Their Beatle influence? Well, Tim Burgess often cited Revolver as a key inspiration to the band. You can definitely hear it in The Only One I Know, that swirling organ riff, the melodic bass line, the sense of technicolor euphoria. The Charlatans proved you could mix rubber soul melody with the 1990s dance energy and still sound timeless. And number 9, we have Cooler Shaker. If George Harrison's sitar had an air, it was Cooler Shaker. Frontman Crispin Mills was all about transcendence, spirituality and fuzzy guitars that sounded just like Within You Without You, but turned up to number 11. Their debut album K from 1996 brought Indian instruments and mysticism into Britpop's mainstream. And as for the Beatle influence, well, it was massive. The hypnotic taktva channels Harrison's Eastern fascination, while Govinda, sung in Sanskrit, is practically Sgt. Pepper reborn in Goa. Cooler Shaker took George's spiritual curiosity and plugged it into Britpop's electric current. At number 8, we have Supergrass. Now, if A Hard Day's Night had been filmed on skateboards, it would have looked just like Supergrass. Their youthful exuberance and wild energy mirrored the Beatles' early charisma. All Right and Caught by the Fuzz have that same melodic playfulness McCartney had thrived on. And as for their Beatle influences, well, they had harmonies, humour and hooks. Sun Hits the Sky practically bounces with Rubber Soul style, while Life on Other Planets flirted with a Sgt. Pepper style concept feel. Supergrass kept the fun alive, something even the Beatles would have applauded. At number 7, we have the Boo Radleys. Before Blur and Oasis dominated the headlines, the Boo Radleys were already crafting lush, Beatles-inspired soundscapes. Their 1995 album Wake Up is a love letter to Rubber Soul era pop. Brass, harmony and unapologetic optimism. Wake Up Boo could easily sit next to Hello Goodbye on a sunshiny playlist. As for their Beatles influences, well, it's everywhere. The orchestration, the layered vocals and the joyful experimentation. Guitarist Martin Carr once said, "The Beatles showed us that pop could be art, but still make you smile." And that's what the Boo Radleys did. They made serious pop sound effortless. At number 6 is one of my personal favourites, Ocean Colour Scene. Britpop's most reliably British band, Ocean Colour Scene were the heartbeat of the mod revival. Sharp suits, Rickenbackers and melodies that felt instantly familiar. Their 1996 album Moseley Shoals might as well have been subtitled Rubber Soul Revisited. As for their Beatles influences, well, absolute melodic craftsmanship. The Riverboat Song and The Day We Caught the Train both glide on classic Beatles chord progressions and harmonies. Producer Brendan Lynch often cited Revolver as a touchstone, and you can definitely hear it. the mix of warmth, precision and swing. Ocean Colour Scene didn't just copy the Beatles, they carried the torch for British musical tradition. Now, I saw Ocean Colour Scene earlier this summer and they are still a band well worth visiting if you get the chance. Now, before we crack into the top 5, let's talk about the moment when the Beatles themselves re-entered the 1990s conversation and poured petrol onto the Britpop fire. In 1995, as Oasis and Blur battled it out for the soul of the nation, the Beatles anthology arrived. It wasn't just a nostalgia trip, it was a global event. Suddenly, the Beatles were back on the charts, back on TV, and back in the musical conversation. The 3 surviving members reunited to record Free as a Bird and Real Love, bringing Lennon's old demos back into the modern age. And here's the key thing, it wasn't retro, it felt current. The production, the emotion, the unity, it reminded a whole generation why the Beatles mattered. Many of the Britpop bands already marinated in Beatles lore took it as a kind of blessing. The timing was uncanny. Oasis released What's the Story Morning Glory the same year. Blur dropped The Great Escape. The Beatles were suddenly contemporaries again. The anthology gave Britpop something beyond coolness. It gave it legitimacy. And it reconnected the cultural dots between 1966 and 1996 and reminded the world that melody, heart and British identity could still rule the airwaves. In a way, the anthology was the Beatles' way of saying, all right lads, the torch is yours. And the Britpop generation ran with it, all guitars blazing. And speaking of torches, if the Beatles were the architects of British pop, Paul Weller was the caretaker, polishing the floors and keeping the guitars in tune before Oasis and Blur even stepped into a studio. Weller had already spent 2 decades keeping Beatles-inspired British songwriting alive. In the Jam, he absorbed Revolver-era energy and social observation. Think Eleanor Rigby meets Taxman and turned it into working-class poetry. In the Style Council, he explored McCartney-esque melody and harmony with a touch of Lennon's activism. And in the early 1990s, as Britpop was forming, his solo work, especially Wildwood and Stanley Road, became the spiritual blueprint for the movement. Bands like Ocean Colour Scene and Oasis openly worshipped him. Weller collaborated with both, playing guitar with Ocean Colour Scene and appearing alongside Noel Gallagher at many events that felt like musical coronations. Weller wasn't competing with the Britpop generation, he was mentoring them. A bridge between Abbey Road and Camden Town. If the Beatles invented the road, Weller kept it freshly paved, just in time for Britpop to drive right down it. So back to our countdown, and at number 5 we have Pulp. Now that we've set the scene, let's return to Sheffield's sharpest wit, Pulp. Jarvis Cocker was Britpop's poet laureate, a Lennon-esque observer of British life with McCartney's flair for melody. But what about a Beatles influence? Well, character writing. Songs like Common People and Disco 2000 are modern versions of Eleanor Rigby and Penny Lane. Cocker admired the Beatles for their ability to make ordinary lives sound extraordinary, something he did in spades. Pulp gave the movement brains, wit, and the occasional raised eyebrow. At number 4, we have Blur. If Oasis were Lennon's attitude, Blur were McCartney's artistry. Frontman Damon Albarn treated pop as an art form. Ironic, layered, and melodic. Albums like Part Life and The Great Escape were essentially Sgt. Pepper rewritten for 1990 suburbia. And as for their Beatles influence, well, there were tons of it. Beetlebum, a title that says it all, channels Abbey Road's lush melancholy, and The Universal carries Let It Be's emotional lift. Albarn often described himself as obsessed with Englishness, just as the Beatles were, finding beauty in the mundane. Blur's sophisticated side made Britpop feel intelligent, just as Revolver made pop feel profound. At number 3, The Verve. Epic, melancholic, and deeply emotional. The Verve brought the spiritual weight of late period Beatles into the 1990s. Richard Ashcroft carried Lennon's introspection and also McCartney's melodicism. The Drugs Don't Work is as soul-bearing as Across the Universe, while Bittersweet Symphony carries the orchestral grandeur of Abbey Road. Ashcroft's often spoken about Let It Be's raw honesty, the beauty in imperfection, something the Verve fully embraced. If the Beatles closed the 60s with reflection and grace, to be honest, they did exactly the same this summer, with Richard Ashcroft's perfectly pitched opening set to the Oasis 2025 shows. Well, you knew they were going to feature somewhere along the line, and at number 2, Oasis. Now, you don't think we'd skip them, did you? Oasis didn't just love the Beatles, they lived the Beatles. Noel Gallagher openly lifted chords, melodies, and just a little attitude from the Fab Four. As for the Beatles' influence, practically every song. Don't Look Back in Anger echoes Imagine. Whatever channels Penny Lane, and All Around the World is Hey Jude on a sugar rush. Even the sibling rivalry had a Lennon-McCartney flavour to it, creative tension disguised as chaos. The Beatles taught the Gallaghers that pop could be both anthemic and emotional. And in 1996 at Nebworth House, when 250,000 fans sang along with Live Forever, it was like a 90s version of the Shea Stadium concert, but perhaps a bit louder, hairier, but spiritually the same. Oasis made being a Beatles fan cool again, and this summer Oasis themselves have been cool all over again, with their shows reigniting Britpop all over again. So who's at number 1? Well, the Stone Roses, the band that quietly lit the fuse. Before anyone said Britpop, the Stone Roses had already resurrected the Beatles' spirits in 1989. Their debut album combined Revolver's experimentation with Rubber Soul's melodic grace. And as for their Beatle influence, John Squire's jangly, chiming guitars was pure Harrison. Ian Brown's cool detachment was very John Lennon. And the rhythm section swing owed more than a little to come together. She Bangs the Drums could have been the Beatles reborn in Manchester. Love Spreads oozes come together era groove. Without the Stone Roses, there'd be no Oasis, no Blur, and no Britpop. They were the spark that reignited the British love affair with melody and swagger. So there you have it. The top 10 bands most influenced by the Beatles in Britpop. So as a conclusion, well, the Beatles weren't just the best band of the 1960s, they were the spine of the 1990s too. When the anthology hit TV screens, when Paul Weller passed the torch, and when a new generation of songwriters picked up their Rickenbackers, the Beatles' spirit was reborn. But Britpop wasn't about looking back, it was about rediscovering what made British music great. Melody, honesty, and identity. And if you listen closely, between the swagger, the guitars, and the confetti at Nebworth, you can still hear the echoes of the Beatles. Because in the end, the Beatles didn't just influence Britpop, they were Britpop, reincarnated for a new millennium. Thank you for watching the Revolver Beatles channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and to tell us in the comments below which Britpop band carried the Beatles' flame the best. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for watching, take care, and until next time, bye for now.